Well, welcome to Psychology 2010, and that's the Introduction to Psychology. And of course, this is the online version and the auditory version of the PowerPoints. Today we're going to start with just an overview of Chapter 1, and I'll give you an overview of every chapter as we start, so it may help you just kind of organize your notes and your thoughts. We'll start out with a general definition of what psychology is, and I think you'll find by the end of this lecture that the field's much broader than you may have imagined. Then we'll talk about two early psychologies or two early philosophies of human behavior, one of which is structuralism and the second is functionalism. And you can still see remnants of both of these early views in modern day psychology, but they're interesting mostly from a historical perspective. We'll move into a more modern take on psychology by looking at current perspectives in the field. And then we'll make a distinction between one specific area of psychology, and that's the area that deals with counseling and clinical psychology, and we'll differentiate those two fields from each other and from psychiatry. And finally, methodology is covered in a separate module for you, so you be sure and look that over. Okay, to begin at the beginning, what is psychology? Most psychologists would agree that psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So by scientific, we mean that we apply the scientific method of techniques ranging from very careful structured observations to experimentation to understand human behavior. Now, most of us study behavior and mental processes. Some of us emphasize one more than the others, but just to give you an example of kind of a classic study that combines behavior and mental processes, there's a well-known series of studies in social psychology that found that people who are attracted to one another and comfortable with one another tend to mimic each other's body language. So there's an example of an underlying mental process of attraction that's driving a particular observable behavior or mirroring behavior. So the next time you're in a restaurant, take a look around and you'll see that some people look like little mirror images of one another and other people not quite so much. So it tells you a little bit about how comfortable they are with one another. Let's move to some early philosophies or psychologies, the first of which is called structuralism. And it's well known because structuralists really tried to dissect thought into its underlying structure. The person who brought this perspective to psychology was not surprisingly a physician by education. His name is Wilhelm Wundt. He was a German psychologist who's generally credited with being the father of psychology. Tishner was his student who brought his views to the United States. Now, structuralists basically use something called introspection to try to get at and access human thought and then dissect it. So think for a minute what it means. When we say we're being introspective, what does that generally mean? And the methodology has some things in common with this common use of the term. It really means you look within yourself. And so in the lab, a structuralist might have you do something like bite into a lemon and introspect and then verbally describe what the experience was like. So you might bite into it and say, it's lemony, it's citrusy, it's sour. And they would just have you go and go and go until you ran out of a description. If you can imagine how odd that process would be, it's easy to understand why subjects were often really uncomfortable in the lab at first. And so in order to help them get used to the process, it wasn't unusual for Wundt to put them through 10,000 trials of different stimuli and verbal descriptions before he'd start gathering data. So quite the experience. And this is Wilhelm Wundt, again, just to get a kind of closer look at him. He was trained in medicine, so not surprising that he uses kind of dissection of thought as a tool. And he is credited, again, for being the father of psych and for separating us from philosophy. Now, in part, in response to this kind of really reductionistic view of human behavior, in other words, this view that we could reduce the human experience to pieces of thoughts, a new school arose, and it was called functionalism. In psychology, functional means adaptive. Maybe that'll help you remember what this school is about. The founder was William James, and I really believe that he developed this view in part because of his own issues. He had struggled with depression as a young man, and I think it's no surprise that as part of his struggle to deal with this illness, he focused on the functional nature of human behavior. In other words, why and how behavior occurs, and behavior was looked at as adaptive. So he did reject that structuralist notion that you could take thoughts and reduce them to pieces. Instead, when he talked about the way we think, he used a famous phrase called the stream of consciousness, which should make sense to you. If you just take a moment to think about how your thoughts kind of ebb and flow and go in different directions as the minutes go on, it's really an ever-changing type of consciousness that's not the same, even second to second. Now, it did not have a precise methodology, but James contributed a lot by just differentiating different parts of psychology. A closer look at William James, one of the things that he did was to contribute to our understanding of animal behavior. He also was one of the first people to look at the links between religiosity and psychology, and also looked at abnormal behavior, which was very unusual at the time. In one of his criticisms of structuralist approaches, he criticized introspection as being like trying to turn the gas up quickly enough to see what the darkness looks like. So that was his idea of what you're doing when you're forcing people to stop a simple process like biting into a lemon and describing it. Let's take a look at some more modern perspectives. One of the earliest is the neuroscience or the biological perspective, and this is by far the most physically oriented approach, as you'll see when we move into Chapter 2. Broadly defined, neuroscience or biological approaches look at the mind-body relationship. So they may study things as diverse as how neurotransmitters influence physical and mental functioning to different structures of the brain and their functions. It is, again, the most physically oriented approach. Now, just as an example of some work that a physiological psychologist might do, I've posted this photo, and what you'll see on the right is the brain of a person with schizophrenia. And this is a severe mental disorder where the person often suffers from hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thought. It's a common and a devastating disorder if untreated. On the left is a person without schizophrenia. And what you're looking at in the white are ventricles, which are actually holes in the brain through which the cerebrospinal fluid circulates. And what you can see by comparing the two pictures is the brain of the schizophrenic on the right has enlarged ventricles relative to the non-schizophrenic brain, and also that yellow area, which is a hippocampus, extremely important in new memories, is smaller in the schizophrenic brain. And so one way to approach severe mental illness would be to look for physical differences in the brains of people who are suffering from the disorder and comparing those to the brains of people who are not. Case studies are often used, and these are just, as you'll see in your methodology module, all that they are really intense kind of studies of one person, or for instance, in my field, industrial organizational, case study might be of one organization, and they're often used in biological and clinical approaches. An example of this is Phineas Gage, and we'll actually talk about him in the biology chapter, one of our earliest case studies about how brain injury can change personality. Moving to the next perspective, let's talk about the behavioral or learning approach. I just want to point out that the word learning usually evokes an idea of mental processes, but that's actually incorrect in this context. The behavioral or learning approach, which was founded by pioneers such as Watson and Skinner, really focus on observable behaviors. So they don't look primarily in the pure form of behaviorism. They do not look at mental processes. They focus on observable behaviors, And they supplement that by looking at environmental events, rewards or punishers in the environment that shape or maintain behaviors. And although it sounds like a simple approach, it can actually be a quite powerful way to understand human behavior. When I talk about these environmental events that shape or maintain behaviors, punishment decreases behavior and reinforcement strengthens it. But we'll talk about that when we get to the learning chapter. If you want to see a little bit more detail about this, you can stop the video here and just kind of cut and paste this link into your browser. It'll take you to a YouTube video that gives you a little more information. Closer look at John Watson, who was a radical behaviorist. This is a famous quote of his, and I'll just give you a second to look that over. And so you can see from Watson's point of view, as long as he could create the world or the environment of the individual, he could really shape their destiny. So very powerful statement that reflects his radical belief in the power of behaviorism. Let's move to the next view, which is cognitive. And in psychology, when we use the word cognitive or cognition, we're referring to thought or mental processes. And so cognitive psychologists study mental processes just as an example of things like memory. So they'll study things like errors in decision making, cognitive biases, and some faults in information processing. Just to give you an example of this, there's a very well-known study by a woman named Elizabeth Loftus, who's a well-respected cognitive psychologist. And Loftus had students watch a videotape, and the videotape showed two cars colliding, a red car and a blue car. And everybody saw exactly the same videotape. Well, after they watched the tape, she split the sample of participants into two groups. And groups 1 and 2 got a lot of similar questions, but the question that was most interesting was this. She asked group 1 a question this way: how fast was a red car going when it bumped into the blue car? Group 2 was asked how fast was a red car going when it smashed into the blue car. And what she found was that speed estimates of Group 2 were significantly higher than those of Group 1. Just because she manipulated one word in a question, it manipulated memory. And as we'll learn in the memory chapter, it is quite easy to manipulate children's memory, but that of adults as well. So we have to be kind of mindful of those limitations. The psychodynamic view is associated with Freud, and more than any other psychologist or psychological perspective, he believes that childhood experiences are important and puts enormous emphasis on the unconscious. It's actually not a very positive view of human behavior because Freud kind of looks at us as being at the mercy of these unconscious conflicts that we're unwilling to face. And he believed that one way to understand them was to try to access this unconscious force. One way to do this was through dream analysis. And one of his famous quotes, of course, shows you how important he thought these dreams were. Just as an aside, to give you an idea of what Freudian therapy was like, here's his original studio, still well preserved in Vienna. And what you'll see, first of all, is a couch where the patient would lie. It looks incredibly comfortable, and that was, of course, by design. He wanted you to relax and just free associate or talk about anything that came to mind. Notice that the green chair, which is sitting to the left, is actually behind the head of the couch. So he would be sitting behind your head where you couldn't see him. And that was on purpose because he felt like he might distract you if he was sitting across from you. So the idea was to get you to relax and just talk about yourself and to reveal more and more about yourself. The socio-cultural view, this fifth perspective, really just puts emphasis on social and cultural forces and is a very new movement, relatively speaking, in psychology that appreciates how we differ as a function not only of our local culture, but our national culture. Just as an example, in Japan, which is a collectivist culture, they really value collectivism or a concern for the group, as opposed to the United States, which values individualism or individual achievement. So we're coming to realize that the more you understand about cultural differences, the more you can appreciate and respect the differences that you find cross-culturally. Behavioral genetics, or the evolutionary perspective, emphasizes the importance of genetics on the expression of behaviors, and this has changed enormously in the past decade even. We are seeing more and more research that suggests that genetics are important not only in intelligence, but also in personality. And of course, most people who are in behavior genetics believe that environmental factors are important as well. I don't think any geneticist would say that just genetics is the only thing that shapes behavior. So it's not that extreme, but it does give us an appreciation of how important our heritage is. So hopefully what I just covered gives you a contrast between what we really do versus what people think that we do. So quite a big difference in the stereotype of psychologists and our actual work. One of the things that I wanted to do in this lecture is to clarify the distinction between counseling, clinical, and psychiatry as fields that have interest in studying abnormal behavior and normal adaptation. Clinical psychology is where most psychologists have their specialty area, and they study problems of medical and non-medical origin. So they may study everything from bipolar disorder, which has some biochemical basis, to eating disorders, which may be more environmentally determined. Counseling psychologists, in contrast to clinicians, have different educational degrees, and in general, they help people cope with less severe adjustment issues, although there is overlap between clinical and counseling. And finally, psychiatrists are the only of these three groups that have medical training, so they're the only ones that can really prescribe medication. Just as an example of how you might try to get insight into a person who is suffering from a major disorder, this is an example of a piece of artwork that was produced by a schizophrenic. And as noted earlier, some of the things that happen when a person suffers from schizophrenia is they have false sensory experiences and false belief systems. There's often distortion in perspective, which you can see in this photo of a piece of artwork by a schizophrenic patient. And of course, we have more structured ways to study mental illness as well, but we have many different tools that we bring to bear. And that is, again, specific to kind of clinical and counseling psychology. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and on our next lecture, we'll be moving into the biology of behavior.